Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Well, we've got a really interesting conversation today. Sex addiction, which I understand is on the rise because of COVID-19. Everyone was stuck at home and people got addicted to screens. And so that's going to be our conversation tonight with Rebecca Rosenblat, who is a clinical sexologist, a registered psychotherapist, a certified trauma and sex addiction therapist, a TV host, a media personality, and an author. She's got a PhD, and she's got a whole bunch of other letters after her name, which I'm going to ask her about a little bit after, in a little bit, to find out what they all are. But she's also very interested in talking to us about sex addiction. Rebecca, welcome to the show. I guess I should say Dr. Rosenblat, but I'll call you Rebecca if that's okay.
Rebecca is better, and thank you for inviting me.
So you were saying that that sex addiction is on the rise because people were stuck at home, got addicted to screens. Is that correct?
Yes, very much so. So whether it's social media or just looking at your phone, gaming became a big thing, and sex addiction, everything is on the rise. And it sort of stayed there, even though the world is opening up again. In essence, addiction, there's the 3 A's: accessibility, anonymity, and affordability. So when you're sitting at home for hours on end, you might be feeling lonely, you might be feeling bored, have a lot of uncomfortable emotions. These are unprecedented times. Then you might look to escape those feelings. And just like gaming, it's so easy to slip into sex addiction. And, being on the computer, it provides easy access.
Now, lots of people throw around the word sex addiction, and you were saying that not all people that just like a lot of sex are addicted to sex. Tell me what the difference is between someone that just likes a lot of sex versus someone that is an addict.
So someone who enjoys a lot of sex, has a high sex drive, has a healthy outlet. It hasn't become a compulsion. They don't have to have it. They enjoy it. But if it doesn't happen, they don't go seeking it. It's not impacting other areas of their lives. And, there isn't this escalation where you need more and more for a fix. That's perfectly fine. That person just has a high sex drive, and it's perfectly okay. In sex addiction, there's a compulsion. There's an escalation, both with respect to quantity as well as quality. And it's an escape. So it looks very, very different. It's a disengagement as opposed to engagement.
What do you mean it's an escape?
Well, if you look at the definition of sex addiction, it is basically using sex or porn as a way of self-medicating to numb out uncomfortable feelings. So if you are bored, if you're feeling slighted, if you're feeling shame, any stuff that, the childhood stuff that impacts us later on in life, if you're stressed out, sex addicts usually come from households where they weren't taught how to deal with emotions. And sex addiction sort of became a self-soothing coping mechanism. So as adults, when they need to escape that autopilot, the brain kind of knows where to go, zones out, and goes seeking, because even the thought of sex or euphoric recall, fantasy, you start to produce your own drugs. So it's harder to quit than anything else because you can't flush the drugs down the toilet or not acquire substances.
Really, that's fascinating. Now, how did you get interested in studying and practicing in sex addiction?
I saw it on the rise in the people that I was seeing. So I wanted to get formal education and have a formal protocol. There's lots of people, they'll say, I can treat sex addiction, but they're just not seeing the results. But if you have proper protocols that you follow and you really understand, it's not the same as infidelity in general, although to the partner it would feel the same. It's very different from that. So unless you have those tools, it's very difficult to help a person come out of it. It's hard enough as is to treat addiction, but sex addiction is the toughest.
Sex addiction is the toughest addiction to treat. Seriously?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I have lots of people that have multiple addictions, because addictions rarely occur solo. There's a constellation. People kind of move between addictions. And they say that, I could quit drugs, I could quit alcohol, smoking, gambling, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But sex addiction was the hardest because you're producing your own drug. So it's really, really tough. And it's the toughest of soft addictions as well. So the hard addictions are substances, soft addictions are behavioral. So it's really tough.
And the drug is what, dopamine or something?
Yes, that's correct. And it rewards you. So, that's why thinking about it wanting to set up a score, cruising for it, any of that stuff is going to produce the drug and reward you to keep doing it.
We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes more with Rebecca Rosenblat, who is a clinical psychologist. She's a PhD. She's an expert in lots of different areas, couples counseling and lots of different areas, but also an expert in sex addiction. And that's what we're focusing on tonight. Stay with us. We're going to be back in just 2 minutes, and we're going to talk about some of the common myths about sex addiction. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So we've got an interesting topic to address this evening, and that is sex addiction. And our guest is Rebecca Rosenblat, who is a clinical sexologist. I said a clinical psychologist. That was wrong. I apologize. It's a clinical sexologist, but she's also a registered psychotherapist, a certified trauma and sex addiction therapist, a TV host, a media personality, and an author. Rebecca, I don't think I've ever seen anyone with more letters after their name than you. It's PhD, RP, CSAT, CST, EMDR, trained havening techniques practitioner, CLC. Can you tell me what some of these letters are? So the PhD is in what?
It's in clinical sexology. And so it's all things to do with sex, anything from intimacy issues to sexual disorders, sexual abuse, sex addiction, incest, people that have been trafficked and they have a lot of struggles. So anything to do with sex, the really tougher stuff as well as the fun stuff.
Fascinating. And where did you get this PhD?
Through University of South Miami. Okay.
And what was your thesis topic?
My thesis topic, believe it or not, was I was studying the wives of the spiritual leaders like pastors when they've fallen from grace because of sex addiction or infidelity in general, any kind of betrayal with their spouse. So I was looking at the spouse's experience because it's rather unique because the spouse is often under attack in those circumstances, whereas normally the spouse would get a lot of support and her identity is tied into her husband's job, so much so that she may not have her own life. And so it's very difficult for her when she loses her identity, what she defines herself through, they go into spiritual warfare. So it was very specific kind of niche.
Really? That sounds fascinating. I'd like to chat with you about that sometime, I think. What is RP and CSAT?
So RP is just registered psychotherapist. CSAT is certified sex addiction therapist. So that just goes along with what I do, just to show that I've got some education behind the competencies.
Okay. And CST?
Certified sex therapist.
And EMDR trained?
So EMDR is a very specific technique where you treat trauma. You can treat PTSD or any kind of trauma that's a treatment resistant. It's also very effective, very quick. So whereas you might do 7 years of, this is empirical evidence says that you might do 7 years of other types of trauma therapy or 1 or 2 EMDR sessions. It's that effective. And there's, tons and tons of stuff written up on it. And
what is EMDR?
So in essence, when you experience any kind of trauma, you're really traumatized, that just gets locked in our memory and we can't process. It's too much for the brain to process. So it just kind of sits there and you keep getting triggered again and again. So it feels as if it happened yesterday because you haven't processed it. So EMDR uses eye movement. So it's eye movement desensitization reprocessing therapy. And it mimics what happens in REM sleep because that's the only time where, the subconscious is fully alert. We can somewhat communicate with the conscious and memory consolidates then. So once you open that up in the safety of the therapist's office, you can, and of course you have to observe the person, you can actually go into that memory and they can process it so it no longer triggers them. But it's really cool.
What is havening techniques practitioner?
Havening is sort of similar to EMDR, but it's like, I would say EMDR is havening on steroids. Havening, you do involve some touch in it as well. And you don't have to actually focus on a particular memory. So someone who can't, who might get triggered or start to dissociate, I use havening with them, because with havening, you can just focus on the underlying feeling or the emotion. You don't have to actually go into whatever it is that started it all. But it does involve touch. Not everybody likes to be touched. You touch the arms and the hands. And so it's very different, and you kind of bring on the delta waves that way. And you can take brain activity from 100 to 200 megahertz down to 1 to 2 megahertz. So it's
really
very cool.
Fascinating. And the last one is CLC.
Certified life coach from another lifetime. It's just kind of there, but I don't do much with it right now.
Fascinating. And so you sent me a list of the typical misconceptions, common misconceptions about sex addiction. The first one is sex addiction is about quantity. Tell me about that.
So this is kind of what we alluded to earlier. Just because you want it a lot, it doesn't mean you're an addict. There has to be that compulsive component. And when you're not indulging in your potion, in some cases, you go into severe withdrawal. I've had gentlemen I've worked with where they were trying to quit. And as they were moving through sobriety and recovery work, some of them literally had the shakes. And just like
they had the shakes because they weren't getting sex.
Yeah, because they were coming off of a drug, a very powerful drug that took a major portion of their thinking and was a critical part of their lives. So just like when you're coming off drugs or alcohol, depending upon how deep you are into the addiction, they will literally have shakes, and they can have nightmares. They can have all sorts of really tough physiological-based symptomatology.
Really? The second one is sex addicts are sex offenders. Tell me about that.
Okay, this is the most misunderstood thing. Sex offenders are a whole different entity. They're into paraphilias. They can be...
Paraphilia. What's paraphilia? I never heard that word.
This is what would be referred to in layman's term as perversions. So these are things that would not be normally accepted. We're not talking about people playing on the fringes like kink and all. That has nothing to do with it. You have consenting adults, you're doing whatever. But there's in paraphilias that a sex offender might engage in, there's actually a victim involved generally, and somebody's rights are being violated. They can also have antisocial personality, possibly sociopathy, but they don't have that compulsive component that a sex addict will have, that compulsion. They can plan out stuff like long-term planning, they can do all sorts of stuff, but it isn't the same compulsive thing. Now, having said that, can a sex offender also be a sex addict? It's possible. Anybody can be a sex addict, so they could be, but the two are distinctly different categories. One doesn't imply the other.
You used a word I didn't know, sociopathy or something?
Yes. So this is, a sociopath doesn't have a conscience about something. So they know it's wrong, but they don't care. Whereas a psychopath is something a little different. They may not even know that what they're doing is wrong, but a sociopath knows and doesn't care. So if you're looking at the spectrum of narcissism, I mean, we've heard a lot of people refer to various, American politicians, won't mention any names, as the malignant narcissist. You kind of continue along that spectrum, and you're looking at sociopathy.
Which is someone that knows that they're doing wrong, but
doesn't seem to care about it.
And do they even want to do the wrong? Are they intrigued by the wrong or something?
No, it's just like they don't care. They want to do what they want to do, kind of thing.
Okay.
They don't worry about what they're doing to others. There's a total lack of empathy.
The third one that you listed was promiscuous people are sex addicts.
Again, a major myth. Now, sex addicts can be promiscuous, but not all promiscuous people are sex addicts. Kind of like all poodles are dogs, but not all dogs are poodles. And this one is a really interesting one, because if a child is sexualized in any way, so anything from being talked about in a sexual way, or they've seen something, they've come across something, to actually having experienced sexual abuse, that child is going to feel debased, devalued, and they'll think that the only thing that they bring, any currency that they bring to the world and indeed relationships, is their sexual value. So they think this is the most valuable thing. They could be accomplished, they could be, educated, doing really well for themselves, but they think this is the most important thing. So when they want affection or attention, or they want to make sure that somebody doesn't reject them, they use sex for that. to hold on to people and to get certain things because that's what they learn. But it's very much performance-based as opposed to pleasure-based. So it's not, I'm really enjoying this. A lot of promiscuous people don't even enjoy it, but they want to make sure you enjoy it, and that you have high value for them. It's almost like a survival thing. These are people in the fringes that were neglected at some point, and then somebody gave them a lot of attention, took a lot of interest. It almost like Stockholm syndrome. Here, I need to hold on to you or to a particular act to make sure that I don't get forgotten.
Really, that's interesting. It's you're describing it's that they're not doing it for their own pleasure. They want to have the other person have pleasure.
Yes. Absolutely. Because they want to make sure that that they're the best you ever had, or that you are really invested in them, won't leave them. So it's always about, performance, making sure the other party has a good time. And many of them, they don't even enjoy sex.
They don't even enjoy sex.
Yeah. And the interesting,
but they do it all the time.
But they do it a lot, yeah. But sex is used for something else. It's currency for something else. And what I often see with couples is they'll say, well, he or she was sexually abused or assaulted, and yet they want sex all the time. So I'm not buying their story that they were actually abused or assaulted, because then wouldn't they hate sex? Well, they may dislike sex, but they can still have sex because this is how they create value and worth in themselves.
Fascinating. And then the next one was someone who's cheating is a sex addict.
Again, if someone is a serial cheater or they have simultaneous affairs going on, then yes, they indeed could be. But in an affair, it's more about the person that you're having the affair with. Whereas in addiction, it's more about the sex act. So the other person is quite insignificant. And in affairs, it's sort of a choice. You can stop anytime you want. Whereas with sex addiction, it's more of a compulsion, and it's significantly harder to stop.
And you finalize, or you conclude your section here that you sent me on sex addiction is about an unquenchable thirst for sex. It's not about sex. Tell me about that.
So I want you to think of maybe food. So sex addiction is no more about sex than an eating disorder is about food. But what they both have in common is beyond the sustenance and, perpetuation of the species, they fulfill other desires. So if you think of food, whether you're feeling lonely or you're feeling bored and you need a reward or you're trying to escape your emotions, you can eat your way through that. People can be emotional eaters. And even as they're eating, they know this is not going to help. This is not, but it feels good in the moment. And right after this guilt and shame and often self-loathing. Sex addict can be very, very similar. They're stressed out, they're antsy, they're feeling badly about themselves. And so then they're thinking about porn or the next sexual fix. It makes them feel good. And once they've indulged, often they will feel bad after the fact. In fact, leading up to it, cruising for it, thinking about it, planning it, is the most exciting part. And once the actual act takes place, it's sort of like, okay, it's kind of done, and they feel awful afterwards. Very different, but with an affair, you could be thinking about that person every time your phone chimes, you're wondering if it's them. And you can be obsessing over them. What are they up to? Wanting to be with them. But it's not related to a person per se when it comes to addiction. Yeah, they might go to the same person over and over again because it's easy access, but the person isn't important at all.
But you're saying they feel terrible afterwards. Why would they feel terrible afterwards?
It's cyclic. So you're feeling awful and you need your hit. It goes up and up and up and up. You have the hit, you feel good, and then you slip into guilt and shame. What have I done? And they invariably feel bad about it. And then you come down to the bottom of the cycle and you need the next hit to get out of it. But most of them, they've sort of crossed various lines. They've maybe engaged in risky behaviors. And often sex addicts do want to quit. So despite their promises to self and others, which are very genuine more often than not when they're made, it's most of the guys that I work with, they'll say like that. You just kind of go into the zone and then you're not thinking. And here I'll have a really deeply traumatized, wounded partner. They'll say, what were you thinking? And I'll say they weren't thinking. It's kind of hard to conceptualize. But that said, I want to be very clear for the partner, whether it's cheating or addiction, the pain is identical. The suffering is identical. So some people say, so-and-so is using addiction as an excuse. And I want to encourage people not to think that, because nobody would want to sign up for it. And just because they have addiction, it doesn't mean that they can get away with the behavior. They still have to seek out treatment and attempt to make amends, etc. Do the 12-step work, all of that. So it's a tough journey.
Now, you said that sex addiction had increased dramatically in the last couple of years, and that's one of the reasons why you wanted to talk to me about it. Why has it increased in the last couple of years?
So because people have been lonely, people have been bored, they've been disconnected from the world. We're social creatures. If the pandemic has taught us one thing, it's that we're very social creatures. The other thing I've noticed is when people are together all the time, so let's say the relationship wasn't great to begin with and you're together 24/7, the kids are home, you're working and you're making sure that they're on Zoom, they're getting the education, the tensions are very high and there's not too many places to escape. So this is a very high stress. This is a perfect storm. There's a lot of high stress. There's no place to go. You're sitting in front of your computer. Some people became very hooked on gaming and they're having a hard time quitting, or social media. But you're sitting there, and if you indulge, nobody's going to say, why are you on your computer so many hours a day? It's so easy. It's so accessible. So whether it's porn or sexting or looking at stuff, not necessarily engaging, self-indulging, any of that stuff, it's so much easier. And what's interesting I found is that, how a lot of the people who are single, they go TGIF, can't wait for the weekend. They're really, really excited. They're going to go out. They're going to have fun. What I found with all of my single clients, almost all of my single clients who were living alone, was that weekend became very depressing through the pandemic, because they couldn't go anywhere. So they drank, or they indulged in sex addiction, they slept, and they couldn't wait for Monday to come when they would have contact with other people.
Fascinating. So unbelievably interesting. We're going to take a break for some more messages and come back more with Dr. Rebecca Rosenblat, registered sexologist, about sex addiction. I'm going to ask her about how it develops and is there any treatment. Stay with us, everyone. This is a fascinating and interesting conversation. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Our topic tonight is sex addiction, and our guest is Dr. Rebecca Rosenblat, who is a registered sexologist, as well as a whole bunch of other things. She went through all of the letters after her name previously, and it's really quite impressive. And your thesis topic sounds really interesting. I've got to have to ask you about that at some point in time. But you were saying that it developed a lot during sex addiction, developed a lot during the pandemic. I wonder if you could tell me, generally, how does someone become a sex addict? Is it something that you're born with? Is it something that you're socialized into? Is it something that's because of trauma? What causes sex addiction?
In essence, children who were raised in households where they weren't taught how to deal with their emotions. So it could be there was chaos, there were addictions, or it could be it was a religious household, a rigid, old school, old culture household where you just weren't allowed to talk about your feelings and you weren't taught how to deal with your feelings. So those kids, their anxiety and stress goes up and nobody teaches them how to cope with that. At that point, they look for self-soothing, and food is accessible. And for very young people, a lot of these people were self-indulging at 5-6 years of age. But it doesn't have to start that early, but often it is as early as that. They may have accidentally discovered that touch feels good, or they accidentally came across an image, saw somebody undressing across the street, and it was like, that held their interest. And even thinking about it was a coping mechanism. Then they weren't thinking about their feelings. So the brain, after this repeated cycle, wires itself, and in autopilot, it'll take you there. And then, sex addiction has dropped its roots into you. It can stay quiescent for years, decades. And then when you come to a similar feeling where you're feeling belittled or alone or kind of left out, any of those feelings, in autopilot, the brain knows exactly where to go. Often there's some sexual component that either they were sexualized or they saw something, but it doesn't even have to be there. So when you're really upset, cortisol, the stress hormone, the fight flight hormone goes up. One of the few things that brings it down is oxytocin, which is one of the things that's released when we orgasm. So, or when, with sexual pleasure. So it's sort of the brain hijacks you there. It's a way of keeping your heart rate from going crazy. It hijacks you there. You indulge, you feel good, and then it gets hardwired. So you're not necessarily born with it. I don't want to say that. There's a greater predisposition, like any other addiction. If you have family members that have struggled with it, it's a lot of people I work with, they have a father or a brother. They'll say, this has been in my family for generations. My grandfather, my father, my brother, my cousin, my uncle, kind of thing. So there can be a preponderance, but we can't assume that it's nature versus nurture, because it could just be the family dynamic.
We talked earlier about narcissism, and you used that to describe a potential American politician. It seems to me that the words narcissism and sex addiction are thrown around, a whole bunch lately, whether it be in social media or just in conversations. Are these things on the rise, or is it just an excuse or a label that people are using a lot more today?
I think people are more aware of it. So that you're right, it's being thrown around, and it doesn't, a lot of people don't meet the criteria for either, but people are very quick to throw that around. And for anybody who is thinking of themselves or is egocentric, automatically people assume that this person is a narcissist. There's a narcissist, and there's some narcissism in all of us. We're on a spectrum. None of us is completely free, or we wouldn't want to excel. But I'm also reading some literature saying that through social media, we are breeding more and more narcissists, because we have the world stage, especially through Insta, et cetera. We have the world stage to say, look at me. And as a way of, and narcissists, you got to know, again, these are people who don't really like themselves deep down, unless you're looking at a malignant narcissist. So they had some kind of an ego wound. So they are obsessed with putting on a show. So if they have to choose between feelings and optics, they'll choose optics. So they can at times feel really bad about themselves, but it's all about creating the right optics. So some of them do have a lot of trauma, but people throw the term around quite erroneously and excessively.
Yeah, no, I think they do. So can sex addiction be treated?
Absolutely, but it's not an easy thing to do. You have to make sure that you're working with someone like a CSAT or someone who has some kind of certification in treating it, because it's not like other addictions. It's not like a generic mental health issue, and it's not like your standard cheating. For the partner, again, it feels the same, but for the person in treatment, it's a very specific treatment. And it's because it's a symptom, you don't just treat the symptom. So sobriety is treating the symptom. Recovery is addressing the cause, where it started, giving the person tools for relapse prevention, teaching them how to identify the triggers. So it's not just about quitting the potion, it's about actually digging deep. And when you do all of that work, the symptom kind of goes away.
How do you know if someone is struggling with sex addiction?
They can, if an individual themselves or somebody you love is struggling with it, there's a free online test. If you go to recoveryzonecanada.com, and it's called SAST, Sex Addiction Screening Test. So it doesn't take that long, and it gives you a score between 0 to 20. Anything above six is considered sex addiction. If you're going 6, 7, 8, it's mild. 9, 10, 11, it's kind of moderate, and then the higher you go, at about 13, 14, a lot of people end up in going to a rehab facility, an inpatient rehab facility. So it depends on how deep you're into it, just like any other addiction. And the deeper you're into it, the more ingrained it is, the harder it's going to be treated. But it is absolutely treatable, provided the person wants to do this at all costs, not because someone forced them into it, like a spouse or a parent.
Right. So you got to want to do it just like any other kind of addiction.
Yeah. So it's not like I used to struggle with the show Intervention. We're going to gang up on you. We're going to make you feel really bad, and you're going to go and fix yourself. So the problem with that is that shaming is the worst thing you can do to an addict, because it's such a painful feeling. Guess what they're going to do? They're going to seek out their potion to feel better.
Can a sex addict ever be faithful?
They absolutely can, provided they've gone through the treatment and they have learned how to express their feelings so they can actually move through their feelings as opposed to trying to escape them. And if they learn about healthy sexuality. And when they're treated, what I find is magical is they'll say for the first time they're touching their spouse in a really amazing way. It's a whole different experience because it's about disconnection. So a sex addict doesn't have sex to connect. They do it, in fact, to disconnect. That's the whole point of it, right? So spouses will say, I was right here. Why didn't you sleep with me? Because I was trying to disconnect. And with you, I have connection. With you, I have guilt, shame. Maybe I feel unworthy. I feel worthless. So it's once you learn healthy sexuality, healthy intimacy, healthy ways of connecting, and you go through the treatment protocol, absolutely. I know many people, males and females, who have stayed faithful for a long time.
So you think that a sex addict can have a normal relationship?
Once they're treated, yes, they can.
You were going to give me some comparisons, differences between affairs and sex addiction.
So with affairs, what I alluded to earlier is the person you're having the affair with is an important component. There's an attachment. Whereas with sex addiction, the other individual is quite insignificant. It's just about the act. There's not attachment. And this is why, it could involve things like porn or rub and tug parlors or escorts. It can involve a gamut of things where connection is not. It's often the person that an addict will act out with is not a tenth of a person that their spouse is. And that's what confuses the spouse, that you were cheating with that person. How could you? What was I missing? So it's very important for the spouse to realize that the 3 C's, they didn't cause it, they can't control it, and they certainly can't cure it. So it isn't about them. So I encourage spouses not to feel that I wasn't enough if I was only prettier, etc. I mean, look at all sorts of people, Hollywood celebrities who've got stunning spouses. It has nothing to do with that.
I haven't heard these 3 C's before. Tell me again about the 3 C's.
So it's you didn't cause it, you can't cure it, and you can't control it. So the spouse should not feel I caused it somehow, even though the addict may have gaslighted them into believing that. They can't cure it, so they can't take their recovery on. It just ends very poorly, and they can't control it. Lots of spouses think if I control your activity and if I control your recovery, then I'll somehow make it happen. The person has to own it themselves, their journey, and the spouse has enough to deal with on their own wounding, their own trauma. But it's easier to focus on the partner's recovery than your own because the wounds are so deep. And
Rebecca, you just used a term that I've also heard a lot sort of bandied around just in the last couple of years that I haven't heard before. Gaslighting. Where did this term come from?
It came from a movie, an old 1950s movie, where I think Ingrid Bergman's character, her husband wanted her wealth. The only way he could access it by declaring her insane. So what he would do is he would leave she would turn off the stove, and when she was away, she'd walk out of the room, he'd turn it back on. And then, she'd turn it off and he would turn it back on. He did this repeatedly. So she started to think that she's crazy. And he kept saying, no, it wasn't on. So that kind of started, that's where the term came from. But in essence, what it means is when you try to convince someone that what they're crazy, what they're thinking is crazy, there's no truth to it. And you do it so convincingly that they start to believe you. And they think, well, maybe it's just in my head. And it's a great way for someone deep in addiction to dismiss their partner's concerns, because partners usually can kind of feel something's off.
That's interesting. So, these words about sex addiction and narcissism and gaslighting, is it just because people are more aware, or is it just more topical, or is there actually more incidents of all these things, or are they just being thrown around?
I think people are more aware of those terms. And yes, for some of the stuff is definitely on the rise, but I think gaslighting existed always. We just didn't call it that. But people are throwing those terms around more because even in media, in movies, those things keep popping up. So people kind of use it like a household word without truly understanding, because there's a lot of misrepresentation in the media when those terms are used.
So if someone came to you thinking that they might be a sex addict, what would you do? Would you take this test as the first thing you'd recommend, or what are the sort of the things to do?
Well, in my intake, I would try to inquire their history. If there was childhood trauma, why do they think that they're a sex addict? Has there been an escalation? Are the brakes not working? Is the impulse control gone? Is there disconnect? Is it taking over other parts of their lives? And at that time, I'm fairly certain that that's what we're looking at. But I do like them to take the test because they need to know that. They need to feel yes. So oftentimes they'll say, my partner thinks I'm a sex addict. Somebody else thinks I'm a sex addict, but I don't think I am. So I'll say, okay, fine, take the test. If your test shows that you're not, I won't bring it up again. But if your test shows that you are, then do we have a deal? Are we going to try and look at it a little bit deeper? And they're bored at that time. So it's good for them to find out on their own.
Right. That's interesting. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in about 2 minutes with some concluding comments from Dr. Rebecca Rosenblat, a clinical sexologist and a very experienced person in a whole bunch of different areas. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Sagan and 60. Really interesting conversation this evening with Dr. Rebecca Rosenblat, PhD, RP, CSAT, CST, EMDR trained, Havening Techniques practitioner, certified LC. She's a clinical sexologist, a registered psychotherapist, a certified trauma and addiction therapist, a TV host, media personality, public speaker, and an author. What's the book that you've authored?
I have actually 9. Some are fiction, some are nonfiction. But what's
9 books.
What pertains to tonight is a book called Overcoming Betrayal. The reason I wrote it was there wasn't anything at the time out there that looked at betrayal from both sides. And we're not just talking sex addiction, but infidelity as well. There's nothing that was looking at the betraying party as well as the wounded party. So in this book, I was very excited about presenting it from both sides because each party is reading their own material, but this way they can kind of get an insight into what the other person's world looks like, and they're reading the same stuff. Also, I tried to combine story and theory, so I created like Jane and John conglomerate, sort of like combined characters, all the combined things that I see repeatedly, and fictitious, but very, very relatable. So the reason for that was to make it interesting. It's not just clinical, but also to engage both sides of the brain, because when you're reading story, it's right brain, and that's where memory and emotions live, and left brain is the logical brain. And so that's more of the clinical aspects. So I thought going back and forth covered different aspects, and people have enjoyed it. When it first came out, it made it Amazon.com in the top 50. Never happened in Canada, so not .ca. Maybe we're not as concerned, but it did really well because of its because it covers everything.
Fantastic. And if people want to buy it, is Amazon the best way to buy it?
Yes, they can go straight to Amazon.
And remind us the name?
Overcoming Betrayal.
Overcoming Betrayal by Rebecca Rosenblat. And you've also got a website, talkwithrebecca.com. Tell us about that.
So there I've got lots of free downloads on various topics, from intimacy to couple issues, self-esteem issues, the whole gamut, anything and everything to do with mental health. And I wanted to say, people often don't know the difference between mental illness and mental health. When they're seeing psychotherapy, they're working on mental health. So it's sort of like, going to the trainer for optimized mental health and healing. It's not a diagnostic kind of thing where we're looking at mental illness. So it's not, they wouldn't go to a psychotherapist to, if they are struggling with schizophrenia, for instance, or psychosis, bipolar disorder, and other things. So I just want to clarify, because lots of people, they say, I don't need a therapist. I'm not crazy. I don't see too many crazy people. I see normal, healthy people that want to be healthier.
Really? And if people want to access your services, is there a website that they should go to book an appointment or something like that?
There's a link in Talk with Rebecca. They can also go to psychologytoday.com. Both places will link them to me. That said, I apologize. I'm booking like about 4 months out and not taking too many new clients, but I do make exceptions, but there is a bit of a wait.
Fantastic. Last question. This is kind of an interesting, different area to specialize in. How did you get so interested in this area to make your profession?
The sex part or the sex addiction part?
Both.
Well, I went from actually mental illness. I was working at CAMH, and it was very heartbreaking. So I went into mental health, started doing a lot of couples work, and I realized that sex therapy was part and parcel of it, because that's where everything expresses itself. It's the ultimate body language, and you can learn so much about a couple if you know about their sex life. So I started doing that, and I was one of the few sex therapists. So people were coming to me with sexual infidelities, and I noticed that there was a very high incidence. Some people close to me also struggling. So I decided that this was something I really, really wanted to study, and I wanted to help people heal from it.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for chatting with us tonight. I really appreciate it. I hope we can chat again about some of the other topics that you specialize in and are very knowledgeable in. And I think that it's interesting, because I do think that some of these terms, narcissism, sex addict, gaslighting, infidelity, people don't understand, and they don't understand the differences. And I think you've done a great job of explaining some of the differences, and some of the potential sources or causes of sex addiction. And I really thought the description of the difference between affairs and sex addiction was interesting. And your comments about how people can be faithful, can have healthy relationships, can get better was very encouraging. And so I really thank you for your time this evening, and for your intelligence, and for your articulate explanation of your profession, and the ideas that you've got, and the solutions that you suggest to people. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to talk about these things.
Well, that's our show for tonight, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videocasts are available on briancrombie.com. My videos are on social media, and my podcasts are everywhere you get downloaded podcasts. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend.